to Medicine Grand Rounds. I think we'll wait a few minutes to let people arrive. Okay, well, it's 7:30. Why don't we go ahead and get started? On behalf of Dr. Borak and Dr. Jossel in the Department of Medicine, it's really a privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, our own Shira Abeles, to give us Medicine Grand Rounds today. For those of you who haven't had the chance to work with Shira, she did her undergraduate education at Princeton University, followed by her medical school training at Columbia in New York, until we were fortunate enough to recruit her here to UCSD. She's we're proud of her as a graduate of our internal medicine internship and residency. She was a Fogarty International Clinical Research Fellow after that, and then joined us as a infectious disease fellow, followed by being recruited to our faculty. I really had the privilege of watching her amazing work during the pandemic, as she served as the medical director for the UCSD vaccine rollout, which was really an incredible tour de force to watch and to participate in a bit. And I'm incredibly grateful to you, Dr. Abeles, for all the work you did there. And I guess now we're thinking about what comes next. And so I'm really excited to hear about the effects of the pandemic and what it might mean for infectious diseases moving forward. Shira, thanks so much for giving the talk this morning.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thanks so much for the distinct honor of presenting at the Department of Medicine Grand Rounds today. Dr. Jossel does ask presenters to give a couple minutes of background information before launching into the content of the talk. So mine will be kind of a segue. Ever since I was a kid, I recognized a sense of physical and mental well-being in connection with the natural spaces, even just climbing trees as a kid, running around the reservoir. And that led me to study ecology in college. It afforded me great opportunities to study ecosystems in the forests in Panama, coral reef systems in Curacao, ecosystems in Kenya, and animal behavior. But I was ultimately drawn to medicine because of the connection that we have with humans and that kind of face-to-face contact and action and impact that we provide. And infectious diseases was obviously a good match. I started studying malaria, which tied in ecology as well as medicine. Knowing I couldn't live and study in Peru as much once my family life started, I pivoted and had that great opportunity to study the microbiome with Dr. Pride. And then ultimately that kind of practical, hands-on appeal of infection prevention and antimicrobial stewardship kind of let me have that practical application again within the practice of infectious diseases. And so, you know, in my time in working in infection prevention, really I was just being mentored starting around 2014. I took a role into microbial stewardship, but hung out a lot with Dr. Toriani. And this is just a slide showing kind of multiple emerging infectious diseases that have been in the last couple of decades. That was shared by Anthony Fauci in a talk in 2017, anything from HIV to the carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae that, you know, we are challenged with in our hospital these days. And in working with Dr. Toriani, you know, it started out with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, prepared a unit in Hillcrest to be able to take care of a potential Ebola patient. In 2015, there was MERS, Zika, making all the preparations for those global pandemics. In 2017, we had our own homegrown hepatitis A outbreak, influenza had quite a year. And in 2019, we had measles outbreaks. And then of course, 2019 already is when COVID-19 hit. And in preparation for this talk, I was just thinking, you know, gosh, it's already been a lot, and COVID-19 was really a lot for all of us. And so what does the future hold, and what's playing into this you know, emerging infectious diseases and what's happening with it. And so today I have this wonderful opportunity, so thank you for that, to talk about this, talk about the factors playing into emerging infectious diseases, describe major environmental pressures that are playing into this, in particular focusing on changes in land use and population densities, biodiversity, and of course, climate change and how those impact the emergence of infectious diseases. And then close with kind of the consideration of where does healthcare stand and UCSD Health stand in this larger picture. So there's I call it a landmark paper published in Nature in 2008 that did something simple, which of course is something really important and really instructive. And what they Jones et al. Did was just look at the emerging infectious disease events that occurred between the years 1940 and 2004 and describe them. And so this was 335 emerging infectious disease events. And what they found was that most of these infectious diseases were zoonoses, so originating in animals. And of the zoonoses, 72% originated in wildlife. They seem to be increasing in frequency over time. And then in addition to that, it's just important to note that they saw there was a lot of surveillance and attention at the higher elevations, but kind of around the equatorial region, where there's a lot of risk for infectious disease spillover, wildlife, and vector-borne infectious diseases. There wasn't quite as much effort into surveillance. And then they also found, of course, as the human population increased, these events increased. I wanted to start with talking about the zoonoses because, you know, that's relevant to COVID as well. But I wanted to start with talking about a virus called Hendra virus, which is a virus of concern that we're keeping our eyes on, because I think it demonstrates kind of the various pressures of environmental characteristics that play into spillover events and the emergence of infectious diseases. And so the story of Hendra virus goes back to 1994 in Australia. And there was a racehorse who was retired and she was pregnant. And so she was relaxing in the fields and was going to be there for the duration of her pregnancy. But the trainer noticed that she wasn't seeming herself, seemed a bit sluggish. And so the trainer brought her back to the stable to look after her and take care of her. But she quickly progressed, developed lethargy, anorexia, so much so that he had put carrot shreds in her mouth and they were there the following day. Fever, tachycardia, face became swollen, she became ataxic, so it was this huge horse, unable to walk straight and falling down, frothy nasal discharge, and they presumed she had eaten something poisonous in the field, some toxin. She died within 2 days. A few days later, the stable hand kind of had a little illness, but got better. But then 6 days after the horse's death, the trainer became acutely ill, was hospitalized with respiratory and renal failure, and was found to have arterial thromboses throughout the body. While that trainer was in the hospital, 17 of the horses in the same stable or adjacent stable developed these same horrible symptoms, 14 of the horses died, and then ultimately the trainer died within a week. And so it was clear this was not a poisonous event. This wasn't something poisonous that the horse had eaten, but this seemed to be a transmissible disease. And so, of course, the CDC equivalent in Australia got involved, and there was an investigation. And ultimately, a virus was able to be cultured from the hospitalized patient, as well as 5 of the horses who were ill. And it was a novel paramyxovirus. So they had identified a novel virus. The stable hand and the other horses who had been sick, they were able to identify that those they were seropositive. So it had this paramyxovirus and had formed antibody. Then they did a broader investigation and looked at the other humans who had been in contact with the stable, with the sick horses, and who had taken care of the trainer in the hospital. And those people were seronegative. So where the heck did this thing come from? And so researchers began to look at the animals, knowing that these are largely zoonoses, and started trapping small mammals, rodents, et cetera. Ultimately started trapping the bats, of which there were a lot in the area. And they identified that flying fox bats are carriers. And then they did a seroprevalence study and trapped over 1,000 of these bats. And they found that 47% of these bats were seropositive. So that's a lot of bats. And this virus hadn't spilled over to humans before that we've known of. And they even looked at people with close contact to bats. There are people who rehab bats back to life, back to health in Australia, and nobody was seropositive. So it didn't seem like the bats were directly infecting humans, because there was so much infection in the bats. But the horse played a key role in this, and the horse was not native to Australia, and it acted as an amplifier. So the bats, when they eat, they just suck the nectar. They're adapted to fly, so they drop a lot of the fruit. So possibly the horse eats some of that dropped fruit, amplifies the virus, and then the humans have a very close relationship with the horses and allow spillover events to occur. And so since 1994, there have been multiple episodes of horse-human outbreaks of Hendra virus. Luckily, there's been no documented human-to-human transmissions, but of course, this is of concern. This picture here was just in the news from last month, where they had identified horse deaths, that this virus is more widespread than just these recurrent events in Eastern Australia. But ecologists noticed a trend that in 1994, there were actually 2 events of Hendra virus outbreaks in Eastern Australia. And then there were intermittently, subsequent to that, there were intermittent episodes of spillover events. And it seemed to be happening at an increased pace starting in 2004. So the question is, why is this happening more frequently? There seems to be a seasonal pattern. What's going on with that? And furthermore, along this time, this flying fox is a fruit bat, and it's been associated with other emerging infectious diseases. So what is going on? And so ecologists looked at the ecology. And the flying fox it's a fruit bat, so it eats fruit and nectar. And its native environment is the forest. And so normally its fruit sources are intermittently placed throughout the forest, and they have to migrate long distances, migrate back to their roosts. But as of 2011, and this is a figure actually from 2008, you could see a map of Australia. And the green represents intact forests, but this red represents cleared forests and bushlands. And 73% of these forests have been cleared for the beef industry to raise cattle mostly. And so there's been massive loss of the habitat of bats. And so what are they to do? They're intelligent creatures. They want to eat. And so the food is concentrated. There's fruit and nectar in the urban areas, right? Where we keep, where we live and set up shop and have our own food sources. So they migrate to their food source. And so this is a figure demonstrating where the bat roosts are. So those are demonstrated by these stars, large circles, squares, and triangles. And you could see along the eastern border of Australia, all these bat roosts. And the red represents dense human populations. with yellow, slightly less densely populated areas. And you could see this association of the bats setting up shop in urban areas where, because their food source has been limited to these areas. And then these white circles are where Hendra spillover events have occurred. And so we are concentrating animals, concentrating food sources, bringing them in contact with non-native species such as horses that didn't evolve with this in Australia. And this is what increases the likelihood of spillover events. So I'd like to pivot and go to a virus that we're all a lot more familiar with, and that's SARS-CoV-2. Where did it come from and what factors contributed to its emergence? And this has kind of been a hot topic issue, but we can all think back to, the winter of 2019 in Wuhan, China, and the initial association of SARS-CoV-2 with wet markets. And there's a picture there of live animals at a wet market. And there was a recent paper in Cell published in September trying to address this question and kind of lay out the story. And I'll just feature that Joel Wertheim in our division here in infectious disease and global public health is one of the authors, and Christian Anderson at Scripps Research Institute has been a major contributor to this conversation. So what this figure shows is, I'll start with what's on the right. That's a map of Wuhan and showing the wet markets, Hunan market where most of the cases were associated, and these other wet markets in the area. Then, of course, the Wuhan Institute of Virology also has a lab there, and that's been the topic of speculation because they study viruses. They set up shop in a smart place for it, but they were studying coronaviruses, knowing that there are things like MERS and SARS not long ago. So on the left over here, we have a phylogenetic tree. So looking at the sequences, and what these researchers did was set up a phylogenetic tree. So these circles represent very genetically similar viruses, and these are viruses from the outset of the outbreak. And lineage B is really what took off to dominate and spread throughout the world. Lineage A kind of petered out. What you can see are these epidemiological links to the Hunan wet market. There were no epidemiological links in these sequences to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And furthermore, there was one association in lineage A with another wet market. And so this pattern of being associated with wet markets, and not just one, but a couple, points toward a pattern that has been seen before in things like SARS, where it's pointing toward a zoonotic origin, where there was exposures along the supply chain, bringing some kind of animal to Wuhan, and then having outbreaks start there. And so this is supportive of a zoonotic origin of SARS-CoV-2. Furthermore, they point out, look, coronaviruses have been known to be high pandemic risk. There are a lot of coronaviruses infecting humans. This is the 7th identified in the last 2 decades. All of the other coronaviruses have zoonotic origins. We have epidemiological links to these live animal markets where they're known to be high-risk species. When they look at the sequences of the coronaviruses being studied in the lab in Wuhan, there's a large genetic difference, and that it's estimated it would take decades worth of mutations for one of those coronaviruses to have become SARS-CoV-2. It's known that it can take years for us to confirm where the reservoirs are for some of these viruses. It took 14 years to identify the origin of SARS. And we still haven't identified the reservoir for Ebola from the 2014 outbreak. So furthermore, there are some preprints today being under review for journals that have reporting that coronaviruses have been identified in bats in the Lao-Chinese border area that are very similar to SARS-CoV-2. So again, this is just showing zoonotic origins. And what was the connection here? The connection here is these wet markets, slaughterhouses, and close contact of humans with wild animals, including the slaughtering of wild animals, is what happened with HIV and chimpanzees. And this isn't just limited to Wuhan and the wet markets there. This is a global occurrence. And I just have on the right an article talking about a wet market in the Peruvian Amazon. And when I studied malaria, I happened to be in the Peruvian Amazon and visit this particular wet market because it was in the city in which we were conducting our research on malaria. And so these are just some pictures from National Geographic, because this was in the news just last month. And here you can, it's demonstrating, freshly slaughtered caimans being sold next to fruit, freshly slaughtered and sometimes live turtles being slaughtered in the area, and then live animals, including, I'd say, primates that I saw when I was there, sloths, etc. But here you have a parakeet and a turtle being sold together in this market. What could go wrong? This is just to show this is happening broadly. This is how life is, and these are really high-risk areas, so there's a lot of opportunity for spillover events. Since I'm talking about Peru, I am just going to share a couple of images from when I was there. That's me in Iquitos, Peru in 2010. This is in the neighborhood near Belén, that market that I just was showing you. This is my colleague, Raul Chuquiari, and this is a neighborhood near Belén. And this is, you could see the houses are built on stilts, and some of these houses are floating houses. So this is in an area where the Amazon, during the wet season, the tributaries come up and flood the area. And during the dry season, the waters retreat. And so it's just kind of a muddy area where you can then walk. You could see, there's dogs, barefoot people. There's area here that's great territory for mosquitoes and vectors and the like. So it was great for studying malaria, dengue, the barefoot, and the animal is demonstrating this is a good area to study leptospirosis, which our lab also is doing. And then when there wasn't a lot of malaria for me to be working on, I did round at the local hospital with an infectious disease doctor there, saw fascinating cases. But on one of the times I was there, this was on the hospital grounds, and it's a blurry image for you, but it's emblazoned in my mind because this was a bat flopping around in the hallway, in the open air walkway on the hospital grounds. And of course, there's lots of rabies and rabies-like viruses in the region, and it was right there in the hospital. So just a demonstration of how close we are to all these species. And then I'm just going to pivot. As I was showing this to my husband, he did say, when we were talking about all these infections that are in bats, kind of was joking, but kind of wasn't joking. And he was like, should we just kind of get rid of bats? And so I did want to address that in case anybody's starting to go there in their mind, and just give them some credit and redirect. Bats are the second most diverse mammalian order. There's over 1,400 species of bats. They're everywhere. They're a fascinating part of, and a big part of the mammalian species. And they are the most diverse after rodents. They only harbor less than 2% of human pathogens as a bat reservoir, so they're not necessarily overrepresented. They're diverse, they're survivors, they're resilient, they live a long time, they're gregarious, they have a lot we can learn from. They have key ecological roles, they control vectors like mosquitoes, agricultural pests, they plant our forests. And we're just scratching the surface of understanding their immunity, and there's a lot for us to learn there. So, just to answer my husband's thoughts as I was going through what seems like kind of terrifying information, we can't just kill all the bats or the rodents, But this also brings me to want to talk about biodiversity and how biodiversity is linked to emerging infectious diseases. And we'll go through a couple of examples. So, in thinking about biodiversity, it can kind of go either way, right? So if there's a lot of diversity, does that mean there's going to be a lot of different viruses and pathogens? And so the more different kinds can spill over and cause infection. I think that's a great question, but the observations have been the opposite, and that with loss of biodiversity, there's been an increased risk of emergence of infectious diseases. So wanted to explore what's behind that. And so we'll just share a couple examples, starting with the West Nile virus. And there was a study from a group in St. Louis who looked at birds in St. Louis and across the US. and was looking at West Nile virus incidence in humans as associated to various factors, but including bird diversity. And as human population density increases, they saw some increase in the incidence of West Nile. And for those who are unfamiliar, West Nile is a connection between humans, birds, and mosquitoes, okay? So as the human population density goes up, there were some years where there was an observation that West Nile was more prevalent. But across all the years studied, there was a strong relationship between bird diversity in a region and the incidence of West Nile in the population. And the less diverse the birds, the more West Nile virus was in humans. So what's going on there? Well, it's something called a dilution effect. And what's happening is if there's a wide variety of kind of birds in an area, the mosquitoes are going to be feeding off of different kinds of birds. They don't know, they're not specific, they're not picky. And some of those birds are going to be good at propagating West Nile, but some of those species, it's going to be a dead end. So when you have more diversity in your birds, the chances of propagating this virus are going to decrease, as opposed to, it seems to be a frequent trend when we're looking at this, as populations become less diverse, those remaining seem to harbor diseases that cause spillover events, and that's what happens with West Nile. It also was observed to happen with hantavirus. So just another example, this is a group in Portland, Oregon, who looked at local communities, forested sites around Portland, and looked at the presence of the virus sin nombre virus, which is a kind of hantavirus, which is a hemorrhagic, causes hemorrhagic disease. And they looked and saw that when diversity in local mammal populations decreased, there was a large increase in the presence of sin nombre virus in the rodents in that area. So this disease is a connection between rodents and humans, and it directly passes. And so the less diverse the mammals, the more likely the rodents are carrying hantavirus. And then one more, just more fine-tuned demonstration of what happens when you lose biodiversity. You know, biodiversity is lost when we have habitat destruction. That's kind of the main leader there. And when habitats are lost, we tend to lose the bigger mammals, the bigger species. And so Lyme disease demonstrates this. So Lyme is a connection between humans, mice, deer, and ticks. And when you have larger mammals, such as the Virginia opossum in your ecosystems, the opossums are great at grooming ticks, and they're not that good at propagating Lyme disease. And so when you have an opossum in the hectare, they kill a bunch of ticks, and then this green circle represents the ticks remaining. And of those, the green represents uninfected with Lyme, and the yellow represents how much Lyme is infected in those areas. But when you have habitat loss, you lose the opossums, you have the dominance of white-footed mice and rodents, other kinds of rodents. All of a sudden, they're not as good at grooming ticks. They propagate Borrelia burgdorferi really well. And so there's more ticks, and much more of them in the yellow are infected than uninfected. And therefore, you know, there's going to be much more likely that if you get a tick bite, you're going to get Lyme disease when you've lost this buffering effect in your ecosystem. I like to think of the biodiversity, it makes a great analogy with the microbiome that we're used to thinking about in medicine, or becoming accustomed to thinking about. When you have an intact microbiome, you know, you have an ecosystem there, and you're kind of more resistant, and you're less likely to be colonized with pathogenic organisms, resistant organisms, such as when you're in the hospital. When folks come in the hospital, we disrupt their microbiome with antibiotics and kill a bunch of sensitive bacteria. There's a disruption there, and then all of a sudden they're more likely to be colonized with resistant or pathogenic strains that are known to be in the healthcare system. Similarly, or in addition, when there's antibiotic disruption, you can also see bacteria that were once there start to behave differently. So we know people are colonized with C. diff. They can be colonized and feel just fine. When we disrupt the ecosystem, all of a sudden that C. diff acts up, can start misbehaving, produce toxin, and cause disease. So I think it's a good analogy with biodiversity on a larger scale. And then one more thought on biodiversity, and just a look at, Homo sapiens. And this is a great visualization of the presence of humans on the planet over the last millennia. And you could see, things were kind of stable. And then once 1800 hit, there were almost 1 billion people in the world. And since 1800, we've just skyrocketed in our population. And so we're the biggest game in town. So it's much more likely we're just going to be bumping into pathogens and things are going to hit into us more frequently. And then, of course, once pathogens do leap over into the human population, as we've seen with COVID, there's a lot of opportunities for pathogen evolution, as we've learned with the variants of concern in this go around with COVID. So yeah, we're kind of squashing out the competition, and there's a lot of us. So these are things that are a natural progression in an ecosystem. So now I wanted to pivot and talk about climate change, and there's so much of it in the news and so much going on right now. So it's a really important topic, and land use is a big contributor into climate change. So we're going to focus on that. And this is just a demonstration on the temperature anomalies since the 1880s, so kind of over a century and a half, and where the temperatures used to range. We are moving farther and farther away from that, and having more extreme weather events. And the greatest greatest causality of climate change is human emissions and greenhouse gases. So I wanted to just start by looking at how climate change impacts infections. And so we're going to start looking at climate change with pathogen growth. And we'll use another vignette and talk about Vibrio parahemolyticus, and we'll go back to 2004 in Alaska. And in July of 2004, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation notified the epidemiology unit regarding a case of Vibrio parahemolyticus gastroenteritis identified in a patient in Alaska. It's not so common in Alaska because Vibrio really needs warm temperatures to grow in. And it grows in aquatic ecosystems. Soon thereafter, there was a patient in Nevada who had eaten raw oysters while they were on a cruise in Alaska earlier that month. And so putting those two together, that's unusual. And so there was an investigation, and they started looking at cruises in the Prince William Sound, and they found multiple episodes of gastroenteritis. You're going to say, cruise ships, why is gastroenteritis a surprise? It's not, but the fact that it was related or thought to be related to Vibrio parahemolyticus, that's what was surprising, and that's what was interesting. And so the investigation identified that the cases had all shared something in common, and it had been eating raw oysters on the cruise ship. And so they looked at the processes behind, collecting the raw oysters, and most of the oysters had come from a particular farm. So they went there, they said, maybe they're doing something wrong. But twice a week, very regularly, written in the books, they'd harvest oysters, put them in a bucket with ice immediately, deliver them to a cruise ship, process them, and have them eaten within 3 hours. So there was no process issue there. But what happened in the summer of 2004, which had never happened before, was that the temperatures of the waters where the oysters are growing never went below 15 degrees Celsius. And that's key because Vibrio cannot grow in temperatures colder than 15 degrees Celsius. So all of a sudden, the sea surface temperatures were much more accommodating for a pathogen and totally impacted this oyster farm, and it was shut down. And here's just another graph demonstrating as the summer progressed and the temperatures warmed and the sea surface temperatures warmed above 15 degrees Celsius, all of a sudden Vibrio could grow where it could have never grown before and causing human disease and a large outbreak. And it's not just in the Alaskan waters. There's another paper published in 2016 demonstrating sea surface temperature anomalies, so the warming of temperatures in our oceans. This is the US, Canada, and the North Atlantic and Europe over here. And this red is showing temperature change from the start of the 2000s compared to the early 1900s. So drastic warming in these waters. And on the right, they graphed out temperature warming in certain locations within the Atlantic Ocean. And what's really cool is there is a project called a continuous plankton recorder. And so at all these, on the left panel where these black dots are, they have been collecting samples of ocean water since 1958 and preserving that for research purposes. And so what the researchers did was they sequenced the organisms in these preserved samples of ocean water going back to 1958 and looked at how much Vibrio was present compared to other organisms. And so on the right, we have these triangles. That represents the abundance of Vibrio compared to other organisms in the water. And you can see as the red trend of temperature rises over time, there's a trend toward increased presence of Vibrio in the waters all across the Atlantic in these regions of study. And then on the bottom, these little bacteria type things are representing outbreaks of Vibrio in the human population. And so it's all the same story. The waters are warming and now there's new disease outbreaks because bacteria can grow and organisms can grow where previously cold temperatures were limiting. They're no longer limiting anymore. Another example of pathogen growth is, something San Diego is known for. We're known for our coccidiomycosis here in the Southwest. That's kind of our special disease in our region. But there are projections with the way that water and temperatures are going to rise over this century, that cocci, which can cause a horrible illness. Those of us who have been practicing here for a while have all seen how destructive it can be. Cocci is modeled to expand drastically and pretty much be endemic to the entire western part of our country. And that's just, pathogens adapting to a changing climate. I wanted to point out vectors as well. This is an Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is a vector for dengue. So as the climate warms, the same thing, more of our land is open to mosquitoes that previously couldn't persist because of colder temperatures. Now the temperatures are warming, and so the vector capacity in the land has increased for these vectors for dengue. On the right, we're just showing trends already observed in the cases of Lyme disease in our country. So in 2001, here on the right, you can see Lyme disease was really on the seaboard, and in 2014, the territory of ticks has expanded and the recognition of Lyme has expanded tremendously in the Northeast. And so as we have shorter winters, ticks can propagate more, there's longer seasons for exposures, and so it's changing our patterns of infectious diseases. I wanted to say a final word about climate change and changes in host ecology. And this was a pretty profound observations. I found them pretty profound, but there's a story here on the left of these very cute saiga antelope that are native on the steppes of Russia, Kazakhstan. Well, in the summer of 2015, there was a heat wave, and within 3 weeks, 200,000 of these antelope just dropped dead. It's way too fast to be a transmission event. So what happened? So in the necropsies, so looking at these dead animals, they found that bacteria that just naturally colonize the respiratory tract of these animals, so Pastorella multicida, just a native part of their flora, turned into a pathogen and caused sepsis on a broad scale like we've never seen before. Killed 60% of the world's population of this species. So the heat is thought to have stressed these animals to a point where something that normally lives in its ecosystem became deadly. Similar events have been observed in our oceans. So this is a sunflower starfish. These used to be all up along our coasts, California to Washington, D.C. Over the years of 2013 to 2018, particularly during warm ocean events, there was massive die-offs of these sunflower starfish to sea star wasting disease. So much so that 80 to 100% of these sunflower starfish died, and they're a key predator maintaining a balance in the ecosystems in our ocean. So looking at these is really the epitome of what canary in the coal mine means. We used to literally take canaries into a coal mine because they were early indicators of something gone wrong and danger to our health. And it would be a signal if the canary went bad to get the heck out. I think what we're seeing in our, animals in our current conditions of climate change are canaries in the coal mine. They're stressing the host and changing the host's ability to adapt and deal with challenges to our health. I also read something also that I found profound, as the climate generally is warming, pathogens are going to adapt to that. One of our adaptations to dealing with pathogens is raising our temperature, but the pathogens are going to be adapting to warmer temperatures. And so just everything's changing in kind of in a scary way. And there's going to be a lot of change and a lot of change in the health system and our practice of medicine as the climate continues to change. So just to sum up what I've gone over so far, human-driven environmental degradation brings wildlife in contact with people and livestock and increases the likelihood of spillover disease, and that spillover disease can turn into a pandemic. Environmental degradation reduces biodiversity, concentrates diseases in the resilient animals that remain and become reservoir hosts, also increasing the likelihood for spillover events of infectious diseases. And then climate change is a total wild card. It's altering pathogens, altering vectors, weakening hosts in a myriad of ways and compromising health in just ways that we'll have to try and anticipate and adapt to and be resilient toward. So at this point, I was hoping to just do a quick poll. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. There is no wrong answer, but if you could please participate, I'd love for us to just answer the question as to climate change and a priority in the health system. I'll just give 30 seconds. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We had good participation. Oh, a couple more trickling in. I'm just going to end now in the interest of time. So let me share results. Hopefully you can see it. But, a spread, but interesting to see. There is a sense of urgency and a sense that, we could afford to give more resources. Hopefully, you understand that's probably where I would vote. But across the spectrum, and there is no, right answer. So I want to just use that. Thank you so much for participating. I wanted to continue, and we've talked about how the changing environment is affecting our health. I wanted to focus a little bit because I think it's very interesting to look at how healthcare is impacting the environment. And I've learned so much about this, and we're doing a very good job at UCSD, so I wanted to share because it's a source of pride for me. So just to start out, especially with a climate summit going on, it's very sobering to look at CO2 emissions. This is CO2 emissions by world region, but China, the United States, and India are carved out as individual countries because we have such high emissions. China has the largest CO2 emissions with over 10 billion tons annual. emissions, and the US has 5.28 billion tons of emissions per year. Of course, per capita, we are the largest emitters. Now, with that knowledge, we're looking at quality of healthcare on the y-axis here, and greenhouse gas emissions on the x-axis here. And so you could see, as far as healthcare access and quality, you know, there are countries providing good access, good quality of care, and the US is among, you know, high performers. But when you look at the x-axis, we are out on our own in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And we just kind of talked about how that contributes to climate change, and it's a little bit shooting ourselves in the foot. To look at the numbers, if we use the knowledge from the previous slide, 5.28 billion emissions per year, our healthcare sector emits almost 10% of the national carbon emissions. And so that's about 450 million tons of CO2 emissions per year, and it's largely related to direct operations and consumption. And when we look at just the healthcare sector on a global scale, the US is responsible for 1/4 of the carbon emissions of the healthcare sector worldwide. So just another perspective, 450 million tons of CO2 emissions per year is greater than the entire emissions of the country of Mexico, the entire emissions of the country of Australia, the entire country of Turkey, UK, et cetera, et cetera. So it is not a small chunk of emissions. And how can we, what I'd like to talk about is how can we reimagine doing the amazing things that we do in a more sustainable way. And I do think there are ways, and I think it's worthwhile sharing how UCSD is participating in this, and UC in general is participating in trying to address this existential issue. And just another view, you know, if we continue to go about our way with emissions, you know, the modeling shows our emissions will increase in worst case scenario if we do nothing as a society. And then it's just sobering to look at what that means in terms of, you know, average warming of the climate. And we know, you know, if the climate warms 4 degrees Celsius, it doesn't just mean it's going to be 80 in San Diego instead of 70. It's going to mean we're going to have these crazy extremes, you know, wildfires, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a way that we can less shoot ourselves in the foot and be more sustainable? And this is a source of pride. UC, you know, has stepped out as a system and has made goals to be carbon neutral by 2025, to have zero waste as an entire system by last year, reduce our water use, invest in sustainable food, invest in sustainable and economically and socially responsible procurement. And so that is a source of pride, and I think it's leading the way. And at UCSD Health, we have a sustainability officer who's under, of course, Patty Mason, Brendan Kramer, Whit Robinson, and she is an amazing resource and is moving UCSD Health as a system toward a more sustainable system. And it's she's tracking the team, the sustainable committee is tracking our progress, involving us in things called practice green health, where we can benchmark ourselves and look at how we compare to other healthcare systems and look at ourselves over time. So this is just a graph that I borrowed from the committee, looking at the UCs, and over the years, so blue is 2018, green is 2019, and purple is 2020. How are we doing on our energy metrics? And UCSD is performing at a median in 2020. And certainly there's room for improvement at our other UCs. And this black line is 90th percentile, some of the health facilities that are really reducing their energy use, you know, towards sustainability. We're tracking other things like water use. So again, here in the middle is where UCSD is, kind of near the median, which, you know, at an academic institution is quite an accomplishment, but I know we constantly want to improve on our sustainability. Here's waste metrics, so how much waste we produce. You can see we have great reductions in 2018 to 2019, 2020. And then just some highlights of some of the other amazing accomplishments that are kind of going on as we practice medicine, but in our system, there are major strides. And I think one of the most visible, and again, something that I feel a lot of pride about, is our food and nutrition services. They've are invested in the cool foods. So trying to get locally resourced foods, increase the amount of plant-based foods that we're consuming, composting, and reducing single-use plastics. They are outstanding. It makes me so happy every time I go to the cafeteria, honestly. Barbara Hamilton's been working with our ORs and greening our ORs. Our ORs are very high intensity energy use, very high resource use with a lot of material supplies. And so there have been various projects like changing out the lighting to LED lights. There's been thousands of dollars of savings in this, and feedback that I've heard through the sustainability committee is that there was actually positive feedback from surgeons who thought the lighting was better. We've removed desflurane gas from the formulary. This was an anesthesia gas that used to be used, but it's an extremely potent greenhouse gas, and so it's off of our formulary. There are efforts to try and reduce waste, think about reprocessing instead of single-use toss products. Is there a way to safely, sterilely reuse some of these materials from the ORs? And then there's a lot of effort in sustainable procurement, investing in non-toxic medical products, again, reprocessing, and trying to look at total cost of ownership to think about not just what we're buying, but what happens to materials and how much we have to spend on, disposal. And then just other things I wanted to talk about, and then hopefully we'll have time for discussion, is I wanted to try and let everyone know about efforts by our sustainability committee called Green Your Clinic. And I've asked I've asked Owen to participate. I'll ask people to listen and participate. I'd love to get some friendly competition going. But our sustainability officers can come evaluate sustainability practices in our clinics, looking at waste, reducing energy use, conserving water, changing the climate toward a more sustainable future. We've had some units pilot this and be certified, and I certainly hope ID can follow suit, and other division clinics as well can also be units. So please consider participating in this great opportunity. I also think we should, we are leading the way and putting a lot of focus on health disparities. Environmental health falls into that category. Environmental issues like air pollution and access to cool foods, healthy foods, local resourcing is definitely in line with our health disparities efforts and should be a priority in our movement to become an anti-racist organization. And then just in our practice, we kind of have to prepare resilience in our medical practices. I think, our telemedicine will certainly help in some aspects, but how can we be more creative and prepare more for what's to come and the health challenges that will continue to evolve as our climate evolves? And then what I've been thinking about a lot is, these changes towards sustainability should be rewarded, incentivized, and recognized. It's kind of like doing primary care for the earth. And so, why can we have our pay for performance initiatives be recognizing our sustainability and supporting and pushing our sustainability efforts? Shouldn't these be in quality rankings? Shouldn't US News World Report care about this? Vizient. And just as I was preparing this lecture on October 13th in the New England Journal, the National Academy of Medicine announced that it's launching an action collaborative on decarbonizing the US health sector. And so they are working to link sustainability to performance. And so there will be movement toward that, which is great. Wanted to give a shout out to our research partners. There's also on the campus a Green Labs program where you could be evaluated and given instruction on how to do things to be more sustainable in our practices. And then through COVID, we've learned how to collaborate, researchers and clinicians and quality persons collaborating with our amazing data resources and research facilities. And can we foster cross-disciplinary research on sustainability practices, resilience? We have amazing resources and continue to work toward working on these goals. So our system needs to adapt to be in line with our goals as healthcare workers and do more preventative care for the planet. The health of our planet is fundamental to our human health. Planetary health is at risk. Healthcare providers are frontline for the COVID crisis and pandemic. We are frontline for challenges posed by a changing climate. So I think in our response to COVID taught us to work together. When we're focused and aligned, we can achieve really tremendous things that we previously thought not possible. And so with that, I welcome questions, comments, of course, ideas, looking for, fostering these communication about this issue. And I thank you so much for the time, the privilege of talking here. It's a great opportunity. Thank you.
That was really great. Really great. It totally opens my mind to a new way of thinking about what we see and do every day. So I thought it was incredibly thoughtful and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a list of questions myself that I can email you later, but there's already a bunch in the chat, and so I'll get through these. And please, if you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A, because that's where we'll be looking here. So first from Don Rubin, with consideration of the hygiene hypothesis, have we modified our environment in relationship to commensal organisms to the point that host range mutants or potential pathogens have more likelihood for establishing a foothold?
Well, certainly we could think about it in our hospital environment. We're adapting the organisms and having to shift. When we try and, blast things, the bacteria always win. I think things are adapting so quickly, and the bacteria and pathogens will adapt so much faster that's really our challenge coming here. And I think I would probably have to read the entire message to make sure I was answering it, but I'm happy to continue to address that question. But thank you so much for the thoughtful question.
Wonderful. And then Calvin, I don't know the last name. Calvin asks, firstly, it says excellent presentation, to which I agree. And then asks, any idea how to educate the masses on the threats we pose to ourselves?
Some of that, we talked about kind of with the COVID vaccines. I have experience to draw off of, providers and healthcare workers are a trusted source. So we know people who, it is very analogous to what we've gone through with COVID. People who are in tune and paying attention kind of have a lot in the news to read about, but it is this slower person-to-person education. I do want to incorporate something like this lecture into education of our providers, and there have been efforts at incorporating education like this in schools, undergrads. I want to provide it to our fellows, so I'm happy to do that. But I think incorporating it in education and just as providers in that clinic space, asking about, if you have a patient with asthma, it might be their air quality, it might be the forest fires impacting that. And so kind of bringing it into the conversation and recognizing it, that it's going to be part of our day-to-day operations, and promoting it like that. But it's a great question. I'm sure there's a lot more we can come up with. But in the interest of time, we can continue to work on that.
Okay, maybe I can throw you one here too. As somebody who's thought about this a lot, I'm wondering what you see and think about when you drive around in San Diego, specifically thinking about, all politics is local, and a lot of this talk is about the way we live with animals, the way we live with each other, and how that's changing our ability to share pathogens. And so I wonder what you think we could do in our local environment. I'm thinking about, the border and the homeless population and the fact that it's hotter here. What do you think do you have any specific thoughts about tangible projects that are San Diego specific that might help in terms of infection risk?
Absolutely. And Barbara Hamilton, the sustainability officer, I think was such an incredible resource. And so I would encourage people to check out this healthcare anchor network. And I think with our opportunity addressing healthcare disparities and kind of systemic racism, both in institutions, but in how we've set up, neighborhoods and things like that, there's a lot of opportunity to work on local projects, building. There are amazing projects going on. So that's what brings so much hope. You know, I learned that Madrid is building a greenway around their city to try and connect local places. So when we recognize that this is a priority, there are massive things we can do and need to do. So I think if you can check out Healthcare Anchor Networks, there are stories where, you know, anchored institutions come together and try and build, you know, not just, we did the mobile vaccine unit to try and bring vaccines to the neighborhood, but is there something more permanent and thoughtful that we can do to kind of build a system where we have gardens in neighborhoods or do greening of neighborhoods that's going to promote healthy eating, that's going to promote having green spaces to feel safe to walk around. And they also cool the local environment. So when we go through those hot waves, there are these cool areas with trees that people can gather in and change the environment. So I definitely think about it all the time. Barbara Hamilton is a wonderful resource, and I look forward to actually working on these projects and thinking about it in our fight against health disparities.
Wonderful. Dr. Boxey is asking us to reduce junk mail, which I think we would all agree would be great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like it's about the top of the hour. Shira, that was outstanding. Thank you so much for the thought and time you put into bringing that to us and for changing the way we think about our environment. Really, really terrific.
Totally appreciate the opportunity, everybody. I look forward to working with you. Emails about vaccines and this topic. So.